The heart. Okay, we're going to talk about blood vessels later, but we did talk about blood. You guys are pretty good with blood, I think. You know what's the constituents. So basically, the heart is a pump center. Really, that's what it does. It just pumps blood into the arteries. So remember, an artery is a vessel that takes blood away from the heart. A vein is a vessel that brings blood back to the heart. So veins drain. And we're going to talk about some things. We mentioned all those, you saw those pretty blood cells, right? You looked at them, they were all the nuclei and the red and the erythrocytes without a nucleus, all those things. So right now, I think one of the things I'm concerned about most is the red blood cell coming out of the heart. No nucleus, anuclear, right? And what's inside a red blood cell is this protein called hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is able to bind 4 molecules of oxygen gas. This is what it's all about. Getting this oxygen into our tissue. Every tissue in your body. Every tissue needs oxygen. There's not one that doesn't. And even the heart has tissue, which we'll talk about, that needs oxygenated blood. So the heart pumps blood to the whole body and the lungs, of course, because we have to go to the lungs, right, to get oxygen. That's where the oxygen comes from the atmosphere, right? Oxygen in to the lungs, and then oxygen into the blood, and then oxygen to the heart to be pumped to the rest of the body. The body, the system. Let's say this word system, to the body, to the system. So also, the heart has to pump blood to the lungs to get oxygenated. So when blood is in the tissue, when red blood cells are in the tissue, this is fully oxygenated, right? This is fully 100% oxygenated. But then after it dumps one of the oxygens into tissue, hemoglobin is basically 75% oxygenated. So it's still deoxygenated, we call it. And it may show blue, like blue blood is deoxygenated, but we call it deoxygenated blood. Well, this is red, 100% oxygenated blood, because it just came back from the lungs and then goes to the heart and then it's pumped to the system, the whole body. So there's 2 circuits within the heart and there's one feeding blood to the heart. So let me just name these right now, because this is one of the toughest things to understand. And it's a simple concept, but just you have to keep remembering it. So there's 3 circuits that involve the heart, really. One is the one I'm talking about with sending oxygenated blood everywhere in the body, and that's the systemic circuit. And this is the one you seem to know the best. Like this is where the aorta is the largest artery in the body. Remember, artery takes blood away from the heart. And then the arteries are red, and they're going to every tissue, from your brain especially, to your arms, to your upper trunk, lower trunk, legs, reproductive organs, digestive organs, toes, toenails, the whole bit. Oxygenated blood. And then it comes back with veins. So you have your arteries and veins, and some in between too, which you'll learn next time. So remember, in the systemic circuit, oxygenated blood in the arteries, deoxygenated blood in the veins. So the blood has to get back to the heart to get to the lungs. So that starts the second circuit, which is a central circuit. It doesn't go out to the system. It stays between the heart and lungs. And that's called the pulmonary circuit. And this one's important too, because the blood that comes back to the heart from the systemic circuit has to be oxygenated again. So it has to go to the lungs. And it goes to both lungs. I don't know why I wrote that. Just one lung. Right and left lung. So pulmonary circuit, pulmonary circulation, that's central, just between the heart and lungs. So it goes to the lungs from the heart, and that's an artery. But guess what? The arteries are deoxygenated blood in this case. And this is something you have to remember for later. The arteries are deoxygenated. And then the veins coming back to the heart are oxygenated. That's the contradiction. It doesn't happen anywhere else, except in fetal circulation before you're born. The third circuit, and this is a really important one for your lifespan, this is called your coronary circuit. This is just blood delivery. There's nothing, it's not like the nervous system where there's branching. I mean, there's a lot of branching, but the nervous system is the brain. It controls all this in most ways. So the coronary circuit feeds the muscle of the heart. That's to the heart. So oxygenated blood to the heart, and then deoxygenated out of heart. And that's red-blue, just like the systemic circuit. So the coronary circuit doesn't even start in the heart, you're going to see. It starts above the heart and then feeds the heart. So when somebody talks about getting like a coronary bypass, the problem is they're not getting oxygen to their heart muscle. And if that happens, you're going to have what's called ischemia, which is decrease of oxygen to any tissue. And if you have ischemia, you're going to have injury. So the tissue will start to fall apart in a way and not function correctly. And ultimately, cells could die, and that's called infarction, myocardial infarction, which is a heart attack. So if coronary arteries are blocked, they either have to be opened up or bypassed from the aorta to the myocardium, which is the heart muscle, which we'll talk a lot about. So these are the circuits. This is where you really should start, and you'll learn the anatomy and then get the blood flow through physiology. So this is cardiac muscle tissue, which you should have seen before in AMP1, actually. This is AMP1. So this is cardiac muscle, different than skeletal muscle. And you'll see all kinds of animations on this. But you may see striations, right? You may see striations like this is a cardiac muscle cell. Which is the reddish, or cardiomyocyte, whatever you want to call it. And it is striated. It has rows of actin and myosin. So it has that striated appearance. But it's also branched. If you could see, like there's white in between. And the white in between is actually nerve tissue. So I'm going to put in, these are called Purkinje cells. Look at this cool word. Purkinje, Purkinje cells, or Purkinje fibers. And that's nerve tissue. That's, I'm just going to put nerve. It causes a impulse to make muscle contract. And this is cardiac muscle. You don't have Purkinje cells anywhere else. Here's a nucleus. It's usually one nucleus, one nuclei, singularly nucleated. All right. I guess this is what the Purkinje cells are pointing to up there. But you see these little structures, and this is what makes cardiac muscle especially easy to see, is these little discs called intercalated discs. I spell it with a C. I just like doing that. You might see a K. So don't worry in the exam, which is definitely going to be an answer, intercalated discs. I'll make sure you get credit for putting a K. So it branches. Can you see the branching and the white in between interspersed cells? So muscle cells are contractile, because let's face it, that's all that muscles really do, is contract, right? And this is heart muscle. So the takeaway here is you have to know the difference between skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. Do you remember skeletal muscle? When did you guys take A&P? About 1985, like me, or something like that? AP1. Andrea, when did you take A&P1? Was it last semester?
Yeah, last
Cool.
semester.
Yeah, that's good. That's good, because then you kind of remember we made a big deal out of the difference between skeletal muscle and cardiac. So is cardiac muscle voluntary? I hope not, because that would be, imagine having to think about your heart beating. You would never sleep, right? You'd die of sleep deprivation. So it's completely involuntary, that tissue you just saw. And you know the really cool thing? Does anybody know the really cool thing about heart muscle? And the whole heart is made of muscle. There's no cardiac muscle anywhere else besides that heart. What's the really cool thing about heart muscle as far as electrical? Anybody know? I love when I hear that click. It means somebody might have an answer. And if it's completely wrong, I don't care, as long as somebody answers.
Is it regulates itself?
That's so well said. I don't think a cardiotelemetrist could have said it better. It has automaticity. It has autorhythmicity, and a lot of other maticities that mean, all it means is it has its own ability to produce its own action potentials, set its own pace. It has its own pacemakers. So if I ripped your heart out and I put it in isotonic solution and kept that solution ions flowing with the calcium, potassium, sodium, it would continue to beat on its own. The nervous system controls it, but it doesn't start it. It doesn't start the pace of a heart. So that histology is really important. The configuration of that histology, those Purkinje cells, and there's different parts of the heart. The pacemakers aren't all in the myocardium like this. And by the way, cardiac muscle is the middle layer, and it's called the myocardium. I keep saying myocardium. I want to make sure you understand what I'm talking about. Because myo means muscle, cardio means heart. So these are the real working cells we're looking at here. The ones, and let's face it, does anybody know the chambers of the heart? Like the top chambers, they're called the atria. Of course, we're going to go through that in detail. The bottom chambers are the ventricles, right? So you have two sides of the heart, right and left, and you have upper and lower. Let's keep it simple, right? There's the top of the heart, atria, right atrium, left atrium. Then you have the bottom of the heart, which is the ventricles, right ventricle, left ventricle. But let's face it, the left ventricle is the rock star of the heart. That's the chamber that's doing most of the work, because it's got to pump blood to every tissue in your body, especially the brain, but every tissue in your body to get oxygen to that through that systemic circuit, the left side, right? So the left ventricle, now that's Jimi Hendrix. That's not like, Kanye West or something like that. That's the true rock star. I mean, the right ventricle, of course, is very important, and then the atria is very important. But the left ventricle, when we look at it, well, I don't know how much EKGs we look at in this class, but that's where most of the muscle is, and that's where most of the contraction and the pressure, volume, pressure, all this is really important to get out of the heart and get to the tissue. So you might hear like the word systole, which means contraction. It's really talking about ventricular systole. So just get those terms down. So the muscle, you should be able to tell us, and I may put a skeletal muscle slide on here, so you have to know that this is clearly cardiac muscle. And skeletal muscle doesn't have intercalated discs. Skeletal muscle is not branched, and skeletal muscle has many nucleus. So and physiologically the difference, like if for skeletal muscle, our quadriceps and our triceps brachii and gastrocnemius, we can go out and run down the street to get a bagel and a cup of coffee, run because I'm late for class. I run back, my legs are getting tired. Skeletal muscle is consuming oxygen, using up all the ATP and glucose. But then I can sit down for a while and I get to pay it back. I get to pay back that oxygen debt. So it's kind of like using a credit card with skeletal muscle. You buy now and you can pay it off later. But cardiac muscle is completely cash only. This thing has to beat from the time you're like 6 to 8 weeks into the uterus. Well, like I say, on a Friday night, sperm meets the egg in the fallopian tube, then the zygote ultimately implants in the endometrium of the uterus, and all of a sudden the heart starts beating. The heart starts developing and then beating. So this has to happen, on the average, your lifetime, maybe 75 times per minute every time. So the intercalated discs are really important to keep that all organized, keep those ions like calcium flowing from cell to cell. And the automaticity of it, the contraction has to be regular, and the cadence has to be within normal limits, and to get good cardiac output, which is the blood coming out of the heart to get to the brain and the rest of the tissue. So this is really important that this system works very well. And the muscle has a lot to do with it. Cardiac muscle. So this is if you took a look at the heart, like from a side view. And I'll just give you the names because this might not be clear when you look at this so quick. But let's say this is inside a chamber. It could be any chamber. It doesn't have to just be the atrium. This is the chamber, the lumen, where the blood is inside the heart. So there's three main layers. The innermost that lines the chamber, of course, like epithelial tissue lines things. So it's epithelial tissue, and that's called the endocardium. Endo means within or innermost. And then this is the area we're living, in the myocardium. And that's in between. And you can see this branching, and you can see the white in between. This is nervous tissue. These are Purkinje cells. And then the red is the muscle. Epicardium is the outer part of the heart. And then there's a cavity because you're going to have, and it's called pericardial, means around the heart. And then there's another cavity, which is your thoracic cavity out here. And that's called the parietal pericardium. So technically the epicardium is called the visceral pericardium. Usually it's that way, like the connective tissue that covers the heart, and this is dense irregular connective tissue. The organ is visceral. So the organ covering is usually called the visceral pericardium, and the cavity that it's in is usually lined by parietal pericardium. That's the thoracic cavity. So in between the thoracic lining cavity, you have a fluid-filled pericardial cavity. So I like to call this sac, pericardial sac, because it's kind of like a sac. This parietal pericardium is like dense regular connective tissue. It's like a loose bag because the heart's going to pump, right? Ba-boom, and then go back. Ba-boom, and go back. Lub-dub, and go back. So the fluid in here is really important to be maintained. It's about 50 milliliters of fluid that really absorbs the friction between the organ, the heart, and the cavity. So that can get infected. I mean, you could have pericarditis or rheumatic heart, which can really create a problem with your cardiac output. I keep saying cardiac output too, but cardiac output is how much blood comes out of the heart, left ventricle mostly, every minute. So cardiac output, I guess you're learning this in lecture, right? Cardiac output. I don't know if you got there yet. Cardiac output equals your heart rate times your stroke volume. So stroke volume is how much blood is coming out of the left ventricle every beat. Heart rate is beats per minute. So let's say you have 5 liters total in your body, 5 liters of blood, which was about right when we learned blood. So hopefully you're getting 5 liters of blood per minute cardiac output. That'd be really good. because that's based on 75 beats per minute. So cardiac output's really important. So if you have a nice cardiac output, good stroke volume, homeostatic heart rate, you're in good shape. But if you have a problem, let's say you have a problem with your stroke volume, which could be from a problem in the heart, cardiomyopathy, which means a problem with the heart muscle itself, or you have heart failure because one of the valves isn't working, then your heart rate has to increase. And the sympathetic nervous system has to get involved now. If you remember that from AP1, sympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system increases heart rate. So most sick hearts are in tachycardia, too much sympathetic stimulation. And that's not good, because the faster your heart beats, that's going to be more of an oxygen demand. It's going to be more of a nutrient demand, and you're going to build up carbon dioxide, right? Carbon dioxide is the byproduct of these cells respiring from the oxygen. So get these down, the different layers. And of course, this is where we live. Endocardium lines the chambers. Epicardium is the outside of the heart. That tells you a little about the epithelium. So this is just showing, where the heart is, and basically that's called the mediastinum. The heart lies in the mediastinum, which is basically between the sternum, the breastbone, and the thoracic vertebra in this area. So all this is in the mediastinum. And of course, these are the lungs. You can see that the lungs have 3 lobes on the right and 2 lobes on the left. So heart is right here, and it kind of goes off to the left. So if your clavicle is here, your collarbone, basically this part of the heart is like mid-clavicular left. So this is the right ventricle, this is the left ventricle, and it kind of sits on this big dome-like muscle called the diaphragm. So the right ventricle is basically laying on the diaphragm, and just let me tell you that the bottom pointy end of the heart is called the apex. So this is just the left lung and right lung. Oops, right lung, and this is your diaphragm. And actually the top of the heart is called the base. Sometimes they like to draw a little triangle. So your heart kind of sits to the left like this, and this is the base is on top, which is kind of contradictory. And the apex is over here to the left. So the apex is pretty thick myocardium too, because if you cut the heart in 4, this would be your left ventricle. So this is really where most of the myocardium is. And you can see that right here. So it kind of goes off to the left. So go through this. This is basically just showing the layers in the cavity. Here's a real anatomy. And you can see like the fibrous pericardium, which is the parietal pericardium, is kind of cut and pulled back. It's like if you ordered a heart from Amazon, it would come with some packaging, and the outside would be that really thick, strong, fibrous package. And then you can see the visceral is kind of tightly like saran wrapped around the heart. And that's dense, irregular connective tissue, whereas the fibrous pericardium, it's also called the fibrous pericardium, but it's also called the parietal pericardium. Parietal is away from the heart on the cavity. So the fluid is serous. I just forgot to mention that. It's serous fluid, not mucus. And that's what prevents the friction. So that fluid, that 50 milliliters of fluid, is called serous fluid. And that's within the pericardial cavity. And you can see this is the left ventricle, very thick muscle. Here's the apex. And there's the diaphragm right under there. And this just shows you the cartoon. We could name the layers. Okay, but we're going to get more into the heart now. Okay, so this is real anatomy. Looks human. It's a little different than the sheep or the pig. So First of all, you have to know your view. This is an anterior view, and nothing's been dissected except for the fibrous pericardium is not here. We took off that big, thick sac. So all you're left with is the muscle. So the apex down to the left, and technically the base is the top here. So this is kind of a tough start because you're looking at real anatomy. So I could tell you this. How do I know this is anterior, first of all? And the way I know it was because these great vessels are in the front, especially this one is in the front. So the left ventricle is over here, or towards, remember, left mid-clavicular line, maybe about the 5th intercostal space. So this is the right ventricle, which sits on the diaphragm, right? Sits on the diaphragm, pretty much like that. And there's some fatty tissue infiltrated there. And the atrium is here. This is really small. It's the right atrium compared to the ventricle. So here's the atria. Here's the left atrium, which kind of looks small too, compared to the ventricle. And this makes it look like the right ventricle is much bigger, but it's not. So those are the chambers. So we're going to go through the heart, and remember I used the word pulmonary, right? So the pulmonary trunk comes off of the right ventricle. So the blood is going this way towards the lungs. You can't see it, but the left ventricle sends blood into the aorta to go to the systemic circuit. So this is the aorta right here. You can call it ascending because it's the only part of the aorta that ascends. And then it forms an arch, aortic arch. So when you hear aorta, think oxygenated blood coming from the left ventricle. If you hear pulmonary trunk, think deoxygenated blood coming from the right ventricle. And then there's two big vessels that bring blood into the right atrium. One's the top of the body, veins, vena cava. So the superior vena cava brings blood into the right atrium from the upper body, upper trunk, and the arms. And the head, of course, the head, upper trunk, and arms. They don't show you the inferior vena cava, so that's another vessel that brings blood from the lower trunk and the legs and everything in between. Okay? You see these vessels, big, thick blood vessels. These happen to be arteries, but there's veins too. These big vessels are the coronary arteries, left coronary artery and the right coronary artery. So they kind of sit in sulci, which are little grooves on the heart. So those are key structures that I just mentioned. I think I mentioned them all, actually. So the right coronary artery and the left coronary artery. And these don't come from within the heart. The coronary arteries, right and left, come off of the aorta, just above the valve, which you'll see later. So it's the blood that goes into the heart muscle, which is fed by the coronary arteries. Remember, the coronary circuit doesn't come from the chambers. It comes from the aorta, oxygenated blood. And this is a big artery that you see coming down the front. Anterior interventricular. Inter means between the ventricles. Artery. I like to call it the left anterior descending artery. And that's a branch of the left coronary artery. Left anterior descending artery. And if this one's blocked, you're in big trouble. Because this is feeding the inferior part of the heart where you have a lot of myocardium, especially towards the left ventricle. And we'll go through the different circuits. Oh, there's base. Also, you're going to see a term called auricle. Auricle is basically just an appendage of the atria, just to get a little more volume. Auricle. It looks like an ear. But that's a good view of the heart. So this is all aorta. This is pulmonary trunk. And if you notice, the pulmonary trunk is anterior to the aorta. Crazy, man. Crazy. Okay. So now we're looking at a model. Let's look at this model here. And you can, see, you can see that this is mostly right ventricle. I'm sorry, right atrium, right? This is right atrium. Right atrium. So you have to get your point of view. This is the pulmonary trunk right here. This is the aorta right here. Superior vena cava, inferior vena cava. Okay. And then you have the left ventricle is down over here. Here's the left atrium. So that's kind of a weird picture. And I wouldn't ask you for this. This is too complicated right now for you to go into that. You have to learn all this first. Okay. So let's just go through the heart. Let me just see what's next. Maybe I could show you in pictures. Yeah, that's not bad. But think of it simply. Let me just see. You have a chat here. Somebody came in there. Okay. So how would you want to talk about the heart? Would you rather talk about it right and left, or would you want to talk about it upper and lower? What makes more sense to you? Speak out, please.
Right and left.
Okay, right and left. I like that too, because it's really, they're two separate sides, and they're function-wise, they're two separate physiologies, really. But know this, they work completely together electrically. They fill at the same time, they contract at the same time, and they eject blood at the very same time. There's a syncytium, it's called. I know these words. Syncytium means everything happens together with muscle contraction, ejection of blood. So the right side of the heart versus the left. So what are the two chambers in the right side of the heart? You have your, what's the upper one called? Atria or ventricle? Stay with me. Yeah. And then you have the lower chamber, which is called the right ventricle. So know this, the right side of the heart is dealing with deoxygenated blood, blue blood, blood that's already been blood that's already dumped its oxygen into the tissue. So now it has to come back to the heart to be pumped to the lungs. So there's three ways that blood gets into the right side of the heart from the whole body. Number one is the superior vena cava. So all the deoxygenated blood from the head, the arms, and the upper trunk go into the heart, into the right atrium via the superior vena cava. The other vessel, another vessel, is the inferior vena cava, and that brings deoxygenated blood, blue blood, from the lower trunk and the legs, and that also includes all the digestive organs. The third way blood gets into the right atrium, deoxygenated, is through the vessel that's called the coronary sinus. Now that's in the posterior of the heart. The coronary sinus is draining the deoxygenated blood from the myocardium itself. So coronary sinus is part of the coronary circuit. Okay, so those are the three ways, and you should remember that. That's the three ways the deoxygenated blood gets into the heart. So superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, and coronary sinus. Now the blood has to go downward then that's what happens. The atria fill first. So we're only on the right side because it's hard to explain both at the same time. So the blood in the atria has to go down into the ventricles. And there's a valve between the right atrium and the left and the right ventricle. And that's an atrioventricular valve. And that valve is called the tricuspid valve. Okay, so what's the function of a valve? Anybody know? Really important. Tariq, do you know? In a heart.
It stops blood from either going in or coming out.
Pretty much, yeah. So the thing with the valves, there's only 4 valves in the heart. The function of any valve, especially the heart valve, is to prevent backflow, because all this blood has to be moving in an anterograde direction. So if it goes back, it's retrograde, and that's regurgitation, which is heart failure. So the valves keep blood flowing in one direction. It stops backflow. So you don't want backflow between the right ventricle and the right atrium. That would be a problem, because that's going to build up in your systemic circuit and cause major problems. So the atrioventricular valve on the right side between the right atrium and the right ventricle is called the tricuspid valve, and that's an atrioventricular valve. Excellent. Excellent. So now the blood is going into the right ventricle through the valve, tricuspid valve, AV valve, And once the ventricle fills, that AV valve
Professor,
is slammed shut because it's got to prevent backflow into the,
Professor,
yes. Yes, you're interrupting me. What's up?
you're not sharing your screen.
Yeah, I'm just talking. I'm
Oh,
sharing my
okay.
beautiful face, Tariq. Come on, you see that. Pay attention. All right. So anyway, the blood goes from the right atrium into the, I'm sorry, yeah, right atrium into the right ventricle. And then the valve has to slam shut, right? Slam shut. So, because that's going to prevent backflow into the right atrium from the right ventricle. So it has to move anterograde. So now the right ventricle is filled, right? Filled with blood, and the atrium is empty for a split second, and the valve closes. Now the blood in the right ventricle goes out of the heart into the pulmonary trunk. So now we're going to start the pulmonary circuit. But there's a valve between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. And now this is not an AV valve. This, and pay attention, and listen to this, Tariq. That valve is called a semilunar outflow valve. So it's outflowing. And it's called the pulmonary valve. It's called the pulmonary semilunar outflow valve. So that's preventing backflow from the pulmonary trunk into the right ventricle. So now we're in the pulmonary circuit because we're headed for the lungs. Whenever you hear pulmonary, you're headed for the lungs. So the great vessel that's outside the heart is the pulmonary trunk. So that blood, the right and left ventricle, that blood is never shared, right? The right side is independent of the left. So picture this now. Now stay with me here. The pulmonary trunk is taking blood away from the heart. So technically it's an artery. Technically it's an artery because I told you before the definition of an artery is a vessel that takes blood away from the heart. So now you're going to get blood into the pulmonary arteries. And both of those pulmonary arteries are deoxygenated blood because the right side is all deoxygenated blood. It's blue, right? So you're going to have two pulmonary arteries because you have two lungs, right? So you're going to have to go to both lungs with that deoxygenated blood. So they're called pulmonary arteries. And that kind of doesn't make sense, right? Because they're blue, deoxygenated. You're used to seeing red artery. So this is the contradiction where the arteries are blue, not red. The only time. So you're going to have to know that when you look at models and when you're asked questions about that. Or you'll see it over and over in the animations, though. It's pretty clear. So now what's going on in the lungs once that blood gets into the lungs? It's becoming oxygenated, right? You're picking up oxygen into the blood. And that's respiratory, really. And then you're blowing off the carbon dioxide because your body does not want carbon dioxide because that blue blood has a pretty good amount of carbon dioxide in it. So we got to get that out and get the oxygen in. So now the blood becomes oxygenated in the lungs, fully oxygenated, like I showed you before, the 100% saturation of oxygen on your hemoglobin in your red blood cells. So now let's bring the blood back to the heart. So here's the question, Tariq and whoever's paying attention here. Guadalupe, you're good. Carlin, you're on your game. So what do you call the vessels that take the blood back to the heart from the lungs? Come on, you can do this. Draining back to the lungs, from the lungs to the heart. What do you call those? And I'll ask you the question if you can figure this out.
Pulmonary veins?
Pulmonary veins. What color are they?
I guess they'd be red because they're coming with blood from the heart, right?
Do you hear this? Nicole, are you listening to this? This is right on the money. And that's the hardest thing, man. That's like the hardest thing to understand. But once you figure it out, it's okay. Once you know the circuits. So that's beautiful. So anybody know what chamber all that blood is going to? It's going to the left side, but which chamber first?
Atrium.
Yeah, the left atrium. Man. Beautiful. So now the left side of the heart is oxygenated blood. And now we can start the systemic circuit. Beautiful. And by the way, I didn't mention this, but the blood coming back from the inferior and superior vena cava and the coronary sinus, there's no valve coming into the heart and the atria. And just like from the pulmonary veins, there's no valve between the pulmonary veins and the left atrium. So it comes in pretty much through pressures and gravity and anterograde flow, of course, well, as long as the flow is going the right direction. So now the left atrium is filling and the blood is going to go into the left ventricle. Now there's a valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle. It's an atrioventricular valve, left. And this one is called the bicuspid valve. And there's another cute name for it. It's called the mitral valve. So remember, the left AV valve, atrioventricular valve, is bicuspid, and it's also called mitral. Right? Hi, Samantha. Okay. So here's the question you're going to get from me anyway. I don't know about the MH Connect. If there is a problem with your mitral valve, where's the backflow going to be initially? And the answer is left atrium, because that's anterograde flow. It goes from atria into ventricles. So that valve, and remember this is really important. It's so hard to describe it. You have to draw it out for yourself or see like a video helps. But the blood is coming into both atria. Atria is plural for right and left atria at the same time. And then the valves are closed at the same time. And then they open at the same time, AV valves. And then the ventricles fill at the same time, left and right. It's a miracle, really. And then, of course, the AV valve slams shut. And then the ventricles are filled and ready to pump blood out, to leave the heart. So we know about the right side that goes into the pulmonary trunk via the pulmonary semilunar outflow valve. But the left ventricle, Jimi Hendrix, pumps blood into the aorta, and there's a valve between the left ventricle and the aorta. And that valve is called the aortic semilunar outflow valve. So that's working under high pressure. And know this whole Jimi Hendrix thing is important because the left ventricle is pushing blood out of the body, or out of the heart, sorry, to the body under very high pressure. The right ventricle, not so much. The aorta itself, and again, you didn't do blood vessels, so you really don't know the histology completely yet, but the aorta is an artery. It's a very elastic artery. You might remember that from 25 years ago in AP1. And it operates under high pressure, so it has more elastic CT, connective tissue. And then the arteries are very muscular. So the arteries and veins, well, really the arteries themselves, like, you know, you have arteries going down to your arms. You take blood pressure, right, on somebody's brachial artery. You use that big, it's called the sphygmomanometer, and you take blood pressure, and you get the person's blood pressure, like systolic, diastolic. So the arteries themselves have so much muscle in their walls that they have their own pressure. So the left ventricle has to work against that pressure. So I'm just trying to correlate this. So everybody know what hypertension is? Andrea, you know what hypertension is? High blood pressure. You know, like an average blood pressure, let's say, is 100 over 80. I'm sorry, 120 over 80. 120 systolic, 80 diastolic. Systole, by the way, is contraction. Diastole is relaxation. So the heart fills during diastole. The ventricles fill. So that blood pressure, if that goes up, like let's say your blood pressure goes up because you have too much sympathetic irritation, your blood vessels are too narrow, they're constricting too much, or you're overweight with too much body mass index. There's a lot of reasons to have high blood pressure. Sometimes there's no reason, just bad luck, Tariq. You just have high blood pressure. It's just genetic, you know. So, but the point is, your left ventricle has to work against that every time it spits the stroke volume into the aorta. So that's going to put a strain on the heart and the valve. So a lot of things can go wrong, right? A lot of things can go wrong. So systole is contraction, diastole is relaxation. So anyway, and that's all the valves. I told you all the valves. There's no more valves in the heart. We're done. All right. But of course, this all has to work in an organized fashion. So let's go back to, let's see if I can put this together in one time before we move on. The atria are filling first. They fill first and they depolarize first, which means the muscles have to, have sodium come in, and then they have to have an action potential. And you have the pacemakers have to be working correctly. And so basically what I'm saying is the contraction of a heart starts in the atria, right? Starts in the atria. I'm not saying it's two separate beats though, and I'll explain that in a minute. So once the atria fill while the AV valves are closed, then there's enough pressure for the blood to go downward into the ventricles. And so the AV valves have to open because you have to fill the ventricles. As you're going to learn in lecture, ventricular filling is very important, your end diastolic volume, especially when it comes to stroke volume. So you don't need to know that for lecture, I don't think. I'm sorry, for lab. But you have to know the parts once you learn the physiology. So the ventricles are filling during ventricular diastole. So you kind of have to say both, like atrial diastole, ventricular systole, or atrial systole, ventricular diastole. So they do kind of operate separately, upper and lower. So I'm glad you didn't ask for the upper and lower heart, because that's harder to explain. So now once the blood fills the ventricles, atria is empty, the AV valves, tricuspid and bicuspid, are going to close. And that makes a sound, right? That makes a sound when those valves close. The AV valves slam shut. And now the ventricles are filled, and then the ventricles can eject their blood. The right ventricle into the pulmonary trunk, left ventricle into the aorta, outside. And then you have, of course, you have to have your semilunar outflow valves have to be open. So once the blood is ejected from the ventricles, then the semilunar outflow valves close, the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve. And that makes another sound, S2. So there's two sounds to one heartbeat. So it's lub dub, lub dub, lub dub, S1, S1, S2, S1, S2. There's two sounds, right? Lub is S1, dub is S2. So 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, lub dub. So the first sound that you hear is closing of the atrioventricular valves, the tricuspid and bicuspid, at the same time as the ventricles are filling. Blood is ejected from the ventricles, and then the second sound, S2, dub, is closing of the semilunar outflow valves. And that's one beat. So one cycle, so what is the average heart rate? 75 beats per minute, most books say. 75 beats per minute. And that would give you that 5 liters per minute cardiac output. So it takes about 0.8 seconds for a lub dub is one beat. It's two sounds, but one beat. You guys digging this? Lub dub, lub dub. So lub dub is one beat, one cycle, 0.8 seconds based on a 75 beat per minute heart rate. So you should be able to know the flow of the heart and the main vessels and chambers and valves that go through the heart. And this has to happen all at the same time. This is crazy stuff, man. I don't make this up. I'm just reporting this stuff. So here you have it. I mean, this is I got to be honest, I don't really love this view that you're getting from this lab picture here, because it's not really showing you the whole picture. It's just showing you the view from the right. So you're looking at the right atrium. So here's the vena cava, right? Superior and inferior. You can't see the coronary sinus, but you should see an opening for it. And here it is, right there. There's the opening of blood coming back from the posterior vessel coronary sinus, which is draining the myocardium. And fossa ovalis, I think I saw that. This is and you're going to hear about this in the animation probably. The fossa ovalis, when you're a fetus, this is a foramen. So, because you don't use your lungs when you're a fetus, your lungs don't start working till the doctor pulls you out of the birth canal and whacks you on the ass. And then once you're out, that's when your lungs start working. So before that, you have nice 40 weeks of gestation when you're just enjoying a nice little ride in the uterus, and the blood is being oxygenated from mom. And so the blood can go through the right and left atrium and through the foramen ovale. So you have to know a little bit about fetal circulation. So this is a hole, and then it closes when you're born. So there's no connection between the right and left atrium. Now, if there is, you're going to have surgery if you have an atrioseptal defect. A septum is a tissue that separates two chambers, and there's one atrial one, and there's a big interventricular septum, which you'll see. So you have that, and here's the opening for the vena cavas and the coronary sinus. This is the three ways that the oxygenated blood gets into the right atrium. And there's the tricuspid valve right there. When you see this kind of muscle in the right atrium, it's called pectinate muscle. It's kind of confusing because there's what's called trabecular coronae, you'll see later. So it's showing a lot. This is a coronary vein. These are coronary arteries. This is your right coronary artery. Now, I don't know if you can see this. This is really important. I always make a big deal out of this. I said it before, but sometimes it's just takes time to figure it out. But the right and left, and this is just showing the right coronary artery, doesn't come from the heart. It comes from the aorta. And same thing happens on the left side. Like this is the left branch of the LAD. But the left coronary artery comes off behind. So notice the pulmonary trunk is anterior to the aorta. That's another thing I like to point out. Don't worry about all this. It's just showing the valve, and it's kind of confusing. So this looks like it's showing more left ventricle, and you can see the different parts of the valves, and that's important. Like the AV valve, and this is an AV valve here. And you notice it has like cords on it. Like pulmonary and aortic semilunar valve don't have these tendinous cords, right? They don't have them. And there's a name for them too. Let me just write it out for you. The cords, they look like heartstrings, like piano wire, actually. They're connective tissue. It's all connective tissue in this part. This is called chordae tendineae. Spelled a little different in different books, but it's called chordae tendineae. And know this, the reason I bring this up is because the semilunar valves don't have those chordae tendineae. And then there's a papillary muscle attached to the actual chamber. So this is a smooth muscle structure called the papillary muscle. And this is going to be on the other side too. It's going to be on the mitral valve as well. And sometimes they call the meat that lines like just below the endocardium, we call it trabecular carne, which means like it's trabeculated meat muscle. So I just don't want you to get that confused with the pectinate muscle, which is up in the right atrium. It's really not that important, to tell you the truth. So the semilunar valve up here does not have chordae tendineae. So that would be the pulmonary semilunar valve, and then you have the pulmonary trunk on the other side. It's kind of tough to look at the real anatomy. This is the LAD coronary vessel, left anterior interventricular coronary artery. So this is all right ventricle. This is all right ventricle. This is below the valve. This is all right ventricle. Sorry, it's in red. So the model's a little bit easier because you could see what the valve looks like. This is the tricuspid valve. You can see the chordae tendineae. You can see the trabecular carne and papillary muscle. Not so clear here, but it's really clear up here. And this is all the right atrium here. Auricle is just an appendage on the atrium, just to give you more volume in that chamber. And the left ventricle. So there's a septum in between the left and right ventricle. And this is important. I like to ask this. So this is called, and remember we put inter. Inter means between. Interventricular septum. There's an interatrial septum as well. It separates the two chambers. So it's inter, not intra. Intra means within. So you'll see different, and I hope better than this PowerPoint, because this one is, it kind of jumps ahead too quick, I think. But you have your PowerPoint for your lecture, so you're probably learning, similar stuff, because you really have to understand the anatomy and the direction of flow before you get to do physiology or pathophysiology, I believe. So if you see chordae tendineae, and again, I call it chordae tendineae, they call it tendinous cords, and this is all connective tissue, then you know that's an AV valve. Okay, I know this is really complicated to look at, but once you see it over and over, then you can come back to this, because I just don't feel comfortable with you looking at this close up right now. This is pretty good, because now you're showing the left ventricle. And if you noticed, let me see if I can get the right ventricle. What slide was that on? Like the right ventricle walls versus the left ventricle walls. Look how thick. This is the Jimi Hendrix part. Look how thick the left ventricular walls are compared to the right. They are that thick. And that's important. And this is the mitral valve, which a bicuspid valve. And the atrium is up here, which is cut. So this is really my takeaway here with you. You have to know how thick that left ventricular wall is to the apex. It's much thicker. And this is the interventricular septum technically, but most of it belongs to the left ventricle, because that's the chamber that's pushing blood into the whole body. So this is talking about your coronary supply. Like the vessel is your left coronary artery and where it's branching to. So this is memorization. Like this is the LAD, which is a branch of the left coronary artery. And remember, these two branch off of the aorta, not the heart. Circumflex artery, circumflex because it wraps around to the back, and it's kind of between the atria and the ventricles. The right coronary artery has the marginal artery, which feeds the lower right part of the right ventricle. So that's an artery now. These are oxygenated. And then posterior, I call this one the PDA, posterior descending artery. This one's important because it's feeding the back side of the heart, mostly right. So most of the time, 90% of the time, the PDA, or the posterior interventricular artery, posterior, comes off of the right coronary artery. Sometimes it comes off the left. Sometimes it comes off of both. So people could have different hearts, basically, or different blood flow to the heart. A complicated view here, because we just have to know what's anterior. And I told you that the pulmonary trunk is anterior to the aorta. And you can kind of see an artery or an aorta is kind of more roundish. And this is the aorta, so it has more elastic. And then the pulmonary trunk is kind of more of an oval or oblong lumen. And it's usually bigger, but it's anterior is the easiest way for me. So you have the semilunar valves right there. And look at this coronary artery. The coronary artery right here, coming right off of the aorta, right above the valve. And this is, if you can hear this, the left and right coronary arteries branch off of the aorta above the aortic semilunar outflow valve. That's a really important takeaway there. And this is showing the AV valves. Very complicated view, but once you look at this over and over, you'll get a good view. So I want you to have some of these takeaways. Yeah, this is a good picture because it's showing how thick the myocardium is at the left side. Here's the septum. Now this is if you cut the heart in half, right, and you're looking downwards at the heart. So you see the thick walls of the left ventricle, thickness, and the myocardium, especially. That's where the thickness comes from, the myocardium. And here's some vein drainage. Coronary sinus, we haven't had a good picture of it yet in this PowerPoint. But the coronary sinus is posterior heart, and this is a vein. This is draining now. So all the blood basically from the coronary veins drain into the coronary sinus. Okay. So the great cardiac vein is in the front of the heart, draining along that interventricular sulcus, pretty much right next to the left anterior descending coronary artery. The middle cardiac vein kind of goes along the marginal artery, right lower right ventricle. So know where these are. And see, these are important that you know where these are. This is all coronary circuit now. And it's not pulmonary, so red is oxygenated, blue is deoxygenated, veins are blue, arteries are red. The middle cardiac is posterior, goes along with the PDA, or the posterior interventricular artery. And then the small cardiac vein goes along with the marginal artery. Yeah, it says it right there. So you got to kind of have to look and use this as a word bank to be able to find these vessels. Not too much. It could be worse. You could have to look for other. But this is coronary. And veins drain, right? Back. Veins draining back to the heart, and it goes into the right atrium via the coronary sinus. All the deoxygenated blood. So, oh, good. Here, I can show you. This is the bottom of the heart, of the posterior heart, sorry. So this is anterior, right here. And you can see that this is a really good picture for you to learn. I think this is much better than what we've seen. So you can see the right ventricle. You can see the right atrium. And this is an auricle too. If you put auricle or atrium on a identification, it's all correct for me. Here's your left. So here's your LAD, your left anterior descending artery, anterior. This is your right coronary artery here. This would be your left coronary artery. This one here would be your circumflex. And you have to write artery actually, because again, there's no circumflex vein in the heart, but still you should always put artery or vein when you're doing vessels from now for the next 2 labs, 3 labs. That's important. Okay, so those are the arteries. Any more? Oh no, we have more. So this is the marginal artery here. Okay, so let's write this in blue. Let's do it the right way. This is anterior. So right here, you have your small cardiac vein. See, now you should really write the vein, the V. And this is your great cardiac vein over here. Okay, so that's the anterior view of your coronary circuit. And here in the posterior, now you really can see, I'll write this, I'll do the veins first since I'm in blue. This is the coronary sinus. Usually a sinus is a vein. It's like a cavernous thing. So the veins are more cavernous. They hold blood at low pressure. So most of the time the blood is in the veins because it's not moving so fast. So that's the coronary sinus. And this number 11 is the middle cardiac vein. Okay, so the rest are basically arteries. Oh, we're like, oh no, I didn't do the big one. Wow, is it pointed? Yeah, that's it. No, that's it, sorry. That's all. That's pretty good. You don't have to know that much. So the arteries now. And this one, number 9, is actually coming out. Remember, now we're looking at the posterior heart on this side. So you're looking at arteries that are going through the back. So this one here is still part of the circumflex. Like right here is the circumflex too. So technically this is the right side. So these are branches off of the right coronary artery. And this one in the back is your posterior descending artery or your posterior interventricular artery. So technically I can't say this is circumflex before you take a screenshot, because you know this is all going into the Guggenheim Museum after I'm done drawing. Although I didn't draw anything, thank God. So technically you could say this is the right coronary artery here. Number 9. I don't like saying that because this is the circumflex over here, which is off of the left coronary artery. Yeah. Yeah, so most of the time, the posterior descending artery is a branch of the right coronary artery. So that's your takeaway. And that's it. That's really all you really have to know as far as coronary circuit. If for some reason, it's always the hardest. Now, this is a pig heart, which you could dissect if we were in class, right? In lab, we'd be doing a pig heart or sheep heart. So it shows the covering. You can see the sulcus. I think this is a key. When you're looking at a heart from the anterior, the sulcus is more oblique. When you look at the heart from the posterior, it's more vertical, the sulcus. Like the posterior, this is the posterior interventricular sulcus. So the posterior interventricular sulcus is more vertical. The anterior interventricular sulcus is more oblique. And you can see the pulmonary trunk on the anterior is more in the front, more anterior, where the aorta is behind it. So here, you see the pulmonary trunk is here, the aorta, and then the superior vena cava. So we like to say PAS in that order, you know, PAS. Pulmonary trunk anterior, remember this is the posterior view, and the aorta is right behind that, and then the superior vena cava behind that. So this is a pulmonary vein right here. Right, pulmonary vein from both sides because there's two lungs. And here's a sulcus where the coronary sinus is. So the sulcus is a space between two structures. A septum is a membrane or a myocardium between two chambers. So sulcus, these are sulci, both of these. So you'll go through that. I'm sure you'll see some dissections. So this is as if we open the heart like a book, basically. So you got to be careful. So you know, even though this, again, the patient owns the anatomy, and this is the left ventricle, but so is this, because you open the heart like a book. It was cut in half, and you open the heart up. So I know this is on your right side, but it's still the heart's left ventricle. Look how thick this is. No mistaking. Thinner right ventricular wall. This is the right ventricle chamber. And these are the AV valves. You can see the AV valve. This is the tricuspid valve. This is the bicuspid valve. So this opened like a book. So please know that. Know what you're looking at. I know that could be very confusing. So this heart was closed, right? And then they cut it in half. So you'll be doing dissection study in ABR, the dissection review, the dissection of the heart, module 9, cardiovascular. I'll take you through that just so you can navigate a little easier. Shoo, crazy, right? Oh, it's a lot. Got your work cut out. Here's that view again. If we dissected the heart in a frontal section, I'm sorry, a transverse section or cross section, you can see how thick that left myocardium is. So myocardium has to depolarize. So that's really important. So let me just see where you're at with that. Let me just ask you guys and gals, nurses and radiologists, and exercise phys people, where are you at in lecture right now?
We finished heart, or
You finished the heart. So you're
Yeah.
moving on to blood vessels? So this should sound familiar, all this stuff, right? That's really cool. Yeah, that's beautiful. You're gonna do really well. Okay, so that helps. So you went through the electrical conductivity of the heart. Really, that's where I'm going with this. Like the SA node, the AV node. Excellent, excellent. So here's the thing. And this is lab, right? We're in lab. I know it's Monday morning. Are we in lab? I don't even know where I am. So the electrical part is all about depolarization. And you probably look at the EKG. Am I correct? You looked at the EKG. So I'm not doing the EKG with you, but just to help you understand, when you look at an EKG, you're looking at depolarization and repolarization. That's it. So depolarization is sodium going into the muscle cell, the heart muscle cell, and that gives off an action potential, depolarization. So that's really what makes the muscles contract. You get the electrical impulse to the muscle. You know the whole story, actin and myosin sliding across each other, and then they have to contract, then they relax, they depolarize, then they repolarize. You need calcium for this, right? you need ATP. And if you don't have any oxygen, you're not having any ATP, and you're going to have an injury, ischemic myocardial infarction. So, of course, the muscles need that, but they have to depolarize first. And the depolarization is the electrical signal. And you might have learned this in lecture. So let's just do it like you didn't, and you could answer the questions if you want. So now all that myocardium we talked about through here, atrium, and remember the atria has myocardium too. It's not just the ventricles. So this is the main pacemaker of the heart right here. And it's wrapped in connective tissue. And that's why we call it a node. So this is called the sinoatrial node right here. And it's in the superior lateral part of the right atrium. So this is where the potentials start, your action potentials on its own. And this is where we want it to start. Because if you have this, right, you have an EKG, right, you have that nice sexy P wave, right? Then you have a normal PR interval, then you have a QRS complex, and then you have a T wave. So if you get that nice sexy P wave every time, and it's regular beat, and it's between 60 and 100 beats per minute, you're going to have normal sinus rhythm. That's great. As long as there's no blocks anywhere below, you're in good shape. So the SA node, the sinoatrial node, should always start the action potentials at that cadence, 60 to 100 beats per minute. So when that SA node has its action potential, it's going to spread all through the atria. So the P wave is showing atrial depolarization everywhere. Of course, this is the aorta, so there's no depolarization there. And then, and the atria, like the atrium, left and right, the atria is a little slower. So the atrial rhythm is, say, like 60 to 80 beats per minute, if they had to go on their own. So it kind of slows down a little bit. And then we go to the AV node, and the AV node beats like 40 to 60 beats per minute. Ventricular, this is now. So the AV node kind of slows things down. And that's why you have that little PR interval right here, that little interval between the P wave and the R wave, which is here. This is the R wave, this is the Q wave, and there should be a little S wave there too. You don't have to see those, though. The R wave is the main thing. So the AV node kind of slows down the rhythm a little bit. Not quite this much. This is still a normal heart rate. It just slows things down. This is the inherent cadence of the AV valve. So it slows things down. Are you with me so far? Yeah, it's because you need, what? Let me ask you this. You take lecture. Why does the AV node have to slow down the cadence a little bit before you get into ventricular depolarization? This is a really important question for a lecture.
So that they don't beat at the same time.
What is it? Let's say that.
So they don't beat at the same time.
Time?
You said that. What was the question?
Oh, sorry. The question was, why do we need that little bit of a delay between atrial depolarization and ventricular depolarization? And the AV node does that. Why?
The little rest,
Why do we
right?
need that little rest diastole?
So
Yeah.
that when the ventricular depolarizes, it doesn't beat at the same time, right? Is that what it
That's
is?
true. That's true. But think of it this way. You need time for the ventricles to fill. The ventricles have
Okay.
to fill. It takes longer. Like, you're not doing blood pressure yet, right? You do blood pressure? No.
No.
So your ventricles need time to fill because you need a really good ventricular filling. You need a good end diastolic volume. So the AV node correctly slows down that cadence. So the ventricles will have time to fill. And then you're going to get good cardiac output. That's completely appropriate for that to happen. So that's the PR interval
Okay.
between P and R. That's a really important concept right there. So now we're ready to go. The AV means atrioventricular. So remember these valves, like remember the tricuspid valve and the bicuspid valve and the septum, atrial septum, and then the AV node and the SA node. The valves are made of connective tissue, dense, regular connective tissue. So the valves are not conductive. So you can't get the electricity into a valve. It has to go through this system. And that's what keeps everything so organized, is that connective tissue skeleton that's made up by the valves and the coverings of the nodes. Because you don't want things depolarizing all over the place. Like Beth Seda said, you don't want it happening at the same time. That would be an arrhythmia. That would be you have a real big problem with cardiac output. So it has to go along this correct cycle from the SA node to the atrial cells to the AV node. Then it comes into an area called the AV bundle in the septum. Now we're at the top of the septum, and they call this the bundle of His. Bundle of His. And then from there, it's going to branch for the right bundle branches to the left bundle branches. In this direction, this is the right conduction. That's why you have a QRS complex. It's part of its negative, right? So the left bundle branch and the right bundle branch. And then you get into the Purkinje fibers within the myocardium. And these are the working cells, like with all the intercalated discs. All of these, even the septum, is Purkinje fibers. Let's not kid around. So now the flow of electricity goes downward, then upward. It makes sense because the blood's being pumped out of the heart, right? Blood's being pumped out of the heart. Can't see the pulmonary valve here. So it's going to depolarize. It's going to start, of course, you start with a little segment. Then you have the atrial depolarization and a P wave. Then there's a slight negative Q wave. That's because the depolarization is still on top of the heart. So it's away from the left ventricle. And then you get this nice tall R wave, and then a slight S wave, and then back, and then a T wave. So the QRS is ventricular depolarization. The R wave means it's going right through here, right through the heart of the left lateral wall of the ventricle, left ventricle. So you get a nice positive R wave. And then the T wave is ventricular repolarization, because it has to repolarize and start again. You can't have tetanus in the heart, right? Imagine that, tetanus. Like I get tetanus from, and I'm not talking about the bacteria tetanus, botulism or anything. I'm talking about, tetanus of muscle contraction. So that's the part of the heart. So you have to know that pathway. SA node to atrial cells, then to the AV node, then to the bundle of His, which is the AV bundle, so it's between in the septum. And then you have your right and left bundle branches, finishing with all Purkinje fibers throughout the myocardium, left and right ventricle. But know this, the septum, the bundle branches are Purkinje fibers as well.